By the time the truth came out, it was already too late. The damage had been done. The silence had lasted for years, and the people who could have stopped it had chosen not to. For a very long time, a monster lived in plain sight, not hidden in the shadows, not locked behind closed doors, not lurking in some dark corner of the world. He lived among family. He ate at their table. He was welcomed into their homes, and he was protected. Protected by the people who knew him best. Protected by the people who saw the signs. Protected by the people who should have stopped him. This is not a story about one man. It is a story about a family. A family who noticed when something felt wrong and chose not to ask questions. A family who heard the whispers and explained them away. A family who saw the fear in children's eyes and told themselves it was nothing. There were moments, small moments, moments that should have changed everything. A look that lingered too long, a touch that made no sense, a child who suddenly grew quiet. But every warning had an excuse. Every concern had a reason. Every truth was softened, until it disappeared. And while the world outside carried on, birthdays were celebrated, dinners were shared, smiles were rehearsed. Behind closed doors, something else was happening. Children tried to speak. Some cried. Some withdrew. Some found the courage to tell the truth. But the truth was inconvenient. It threatened reputations. It threatened comfort. It threatened the image of a perfect family. So it was ignored. And with every moment of silence, the monster grew bolder. He learned what he could get away with. He learned who would protect him. He learned that no one was going to stop him. This crime was not hidden. It was allowed. It was defended. It was protected. And when the truth finally surfaced, when the lies collapsed, when the silence broke, everyone asked the same question. How could this happen? But that is the wrong question. The real question is this: how does evil survive for so long? When everyone knows? Before anyone called him a monster, he was just a boy who grew up in a quiet neighborhood, a boy who came from a family that looked normal. From the outside, there was nothing remarkable about Daniel Mercer. He wasn't loud, he wasn't violent, he wasn't known for trouble. If anything, people described him as polite, quiet, a little strange, but harmless. Daniel Mercer was born into a family that valued order, routine, and reputation. His father, Robert Mercer, believed in discipline above all else. Rules were followed, questions were discouraged, mistakes were corrected quickly and privately. His mother, Elaine Mercer, was softer, gentle, protective. She believed problems should be handled inside the family, that outsiders could never understand what happened behind closed doors. And behind those doors, emotions were rarely discussed. Daniel learned early on how to stay unnoticed, how to blend in, how to observe instead of participate. Teachers remembered him as quiet, almost invisible. Classmates said he made them uncomfortable, but they could never explain why. There were no dramatic outbursts, no public warning signs, just a feeling, a sense that something was off. At home, Daniel was rarely challenged. When he crossed a line, it was excused. He didn't mean it. He's misunderstood. He's just different. Every strange behavior had an explanation. Every concern was minimized, and slowly Daniel learned something important. He learned that rules could bend. He learned that boundaries were negotiable. He learned that his family would protect him, no matter what. As he grew older, those protections followed him. When teachers raised concerns, his parents intervened. When neighbors noticed odd behavior, it was dismissed as gossip. When relatives felt uncomfortable, they were told they were overreacting. The family closed ranks, because in the Mercer household, appearances mattered more than truth. Daniel watched all of this carefully. He learned when to stay quiet, when to smile, when to act normal, and when not to. There were moments, small moments, that could have changed everything. A comment made at the wrong time, a stare that lingered too long, a reaction that didn't match the situation. But each time, someone explained it away. Someone defended him. Someone chose comfort over confrontation. And with every excuse, Daniel learned he was safe. Safe from consequences. Safe from accountability. Safe from being questioned. By the time he reached adulthood, the pattern was already set. Daniel Mercer didn't need to hide. He didn't need to run. Because the people closest to him had already built a shield, and that shield would protect him for years. What no one understood at the time was that this protection was not harmless. It was permission. From the outside, the Mercer family looked like any other. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where lawns were trimmed, where neighbors waved but didn't ask questions. Daniel Mercer had a job, nothing impressive, nothing alarming. He showed up on time. He followed instructions. He blended in. To most people, he was forgettable, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Family gatherings were frequent, birthdays, holidays, Sunday dinners that followed the same routine every time. Laughter filled the house. Photos were taken, memories were made. At least that's how it looked. Inside the Mercer home, there was an unspoken rule. Nothing uncomfortable was discussed. If tension appeared, it was smoothed over. If someone felt uneasy, they kept it to themselves. And if a line was crossed, no one named it. Daniel moved freely through these spaces, living rooms, hallways, bedrooms, always present, always watching. Children were often around, nieces, nephews, family friends. No one thought much of it. Daniel was family. Daniel was trusted. Parents left the room without concern. Doors stayed open. Boundaries were assumed, but never stated. There were moments that didn't sit right. A child who suddenly didn't want to visit anymore. A quiet change in behavior. A discomfort no one could explain. But every time, someone had a reason. They're just tired. They're being dramatic. They'll grow out of it. Daniel noticed these moments. He noticed who spoke up and who stayed silent. He noticed which adults avoided eye contact and which ones defended him. He learned who would believe him and who wouldn't. Slowly, the warning signs grew, but they never arrived all at once. They came in pieces. A joke that went too far, a comment that made the room go quiet, a touch that lingered just a second too long, enough to cause discomfort, not enough to cause alarm. And every time the family closed ranks, because calling it out would mean admitting something was wrong, and nothing was wrong. At least that's what they told themselves. Daniel's parents were always nearby, always present, always ready to intervene, not to protect others, but to protect him. If someone raised a concern, it was shut down quickly. If a child seemed afraid, it was blamed on imagination. If questions were asked, they were redirected. Over time, the family learned how to ignore what they didn't want to see, and Daniel learned something else. He learned patience. He learned restraint. He learned how to wait. Because the safest place for a monster is inside a family that refuses to look too closely. Outside the house, life went on. Neighbors waved, teachers nodded, friends stopped by. No police, no investigations, no consequences, just silence. And silence has a way of normalizing the unthinkable. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it had already been wrong for a long time. Looking back, the signs were everywhere. They just didn't look like signs at the time. At first, the changes were subtle, so subtle that no one felt confident enough to say anything out loud. It started with silence. Children who once laughed freely became withdrawn. Voices grew quieter. Eye contact disappeared. Some stopped wanting to visit the Mercer home. Others found excuses to stay close to adults. No one connected the dots. They never do. Parents noticed the changes, but only in passing. A bad mood, a phase, growing pains. Anything was easier than asking the wrong question. Daniel Mercer remained exactly the same, calm, polite, unbothered. If anything, he became more present, more involved, always offering to help, always volunteering to watch the kids, always available. It looked responsible, caring, trustworthy, and trust is powerful. There were moments that should have stopped everything. A child who flinched when Daniel entered the room, a sudden fear of being alone, nightmares no one could explain, but every time someone found a reason. They're just sensitive. They're overreacting. They must have misunderstood. The adults wanted these explanations to be true, so they accepted them. Daniel's behavior shifted in small ways. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. Just enough to feel wrong. He lingered where he didn't need to be, listened when he wasn't part of the conversation, appeared in places without explanation. And every time someone noticed, they said nothing, because saying something would mean breaking the illusion. And the illusion was comfortable. Inside the family, concerns were handled quietly. A conversation behind closed doors, a warning that wasn't really a warning, a promise to keep an eye on things. But no one ever named the danger. No one ever drew a line. Because doing so would mean admitting that the monster was already inside the house. Daniel noticed this, too. He noticed the hesitation, the discomfort, the way adults looked away. He learned where the blind spots were. And he learned how to use them. As time passed, the warning signs became harder to ignore. A child who refused to be alone with him. A sudden emotional breakdown, a moment of fear that didn't make sense. Someone finally asked a question, quietly, carefully, but the answer came quickly. Daniel was defended. His parents insisted he would never do such a thing. Relatives reminded everyone how good he was. The family image closed in around him. The question was buried, and the silence returned. From that moment on, something changed. The house felt heavier, the air felt tense. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Something was wrong. And yet, nothing was done, because acknowledging the truth would mean tearing the family apart, and protecting the family had become more important than protecting the children. Daniel continued on as before, confident now, not reckless, not careless, just certain. Certain that no one would stop him. Certain that even if someone spoke up, they wouldn't be believed. This was no longer about ignorance. This was about denial, and denial has consequences. By the time the warning signs became undeniable, by the time the fear could no longer be explained away, the damage had already begun. And still, no one called the police. If you're still listening, it's because something already feels wrong. You may not be able to explain it yet, but you can feel it. That quiet tension. That sense that the truth is being avoided. Stories like this don't begin with violence. They begin with silence, and silence has a way of convincing people that nothing is happening, even when it is. If you're still here, type, "I see it now" in the comments. Not for us, for yourself. Because what happens next is where the silence starts to crack. The first real warning didn't come from a child. It came from an adult who could no longer look away. The first real warning did not come from a child. It came from an adult who could no longer ignore what they were seeing. For a long time, the discomfort had been easy to dismiss. But now it was becoming impossible to explain away. It started with small observations. A child who refused to enter a room if Daniel Mercer was already inside. A sudden panic when left alone. Tears that came without warning. At first, these moments were treated gently. a hand on the shoulder, a reassuring smile. But one adult noticed something different. They noticed the fear wasn't random. It was specific. It appeared at the sound of Daniel's voice, at the mention of his name, at the sight of his car pulling into the driveway. This time the concern wasn't whispered. It was spoken out loud, carefully, quietly, but clearly. The response came immediately. Daniel's parents dismissed it. They insisted there was a misunderstanding, that the child was confused, that Daniel would never do something like that. They reminded everyone of his calm nature, his good behavior, his history of being misjudged. Once again, the family closed ranks, but something had changed. The question had been asked. And once a question exists, it doesn't disappear easily. Daniel felt it. He noticed the shift in the room, the hesitation, the watchful eyes. For the first time, his presence was being noticed. And for the first time, he became more careful, less visible, more controlled. At the same time, the fear in the children intensified. One child stopped speaking altogether. Another began acting out in ways no one could explain. There were nightmares, sudden emotional outbursts, moments of panic that left adults shaken. This was no longer subtle, and one adult could no longer stay silent. They reached out, not loudly, not publicly, but deliberately. A quiet conversation with a school counselor, a question posed to someone outside the family, and for the first time, the story left the house. The response was slow, cautious. Questions were asked, notes were taken, but there was no immediate action because there was no evidence. No witnesses willing to speak, no physical proof, just fear. And fear, on its own, is easy to dismiss. When the family found out, they reacted quickly. Daniel was pulled back, kept close, watched more carefully. Rules were suggested, doors were kept open, time alone was reduced. But nothing was confronted directly, no accusations, no consequences, just more silence. And Daniel understood exactly what was happening. He knew he had come close, too close, but he also knew something else. The family was still protecting him. And as long as they did, he was safe. Whatever line he had crossed, it had not yet cost him anything. So life went on. Outwardly, everything returned to normal. But underneath, something was breaking. Trust had cracked, fear had taken root, and the silence that once felt comfortable now felt dangerous. Because once the truth begins to surface, it doesn't stop trying to be heard. The family believed they had contained the problem. They were wrong. The next voice to speak would refuse to be silenced. For a long time, the truth stayed hidden because no one was brave enough to say it out loud, until one person was. Her name was Sarah Collins. Sarah was 14 years old. She was quiet, observant, the kind of girl who noticed details other people missed. She had spent enough time around Daniel Mercer to know that something wasn't right. At first, she tried to ignore the feeling. She told herself she was imagining things, that she was overthinking, that adults always knew better. But the fear didn't go away. It followed her. It appeared in moments she couldn't control, in sudden anxiety, in sleepless nights, and slowly, she realized she wasn't the only one. She noticed how other children reacted around Daniel, how their moods changed, how they avoided being alone. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Still, Sarah stayed silent, because speaking up felt dangerous. She knew what Daniel meant to the family. She knew how protected he was. She knew how quickly the truth could be turned against her. But fear has a breaking point, and eventually, Sarah reached hers. She spoke to someone outside the family, not loudly, not dramatically. She told the truth quietly, carefully. The words felt heavy as they left her mouth, like something she might never be able to take back. And she was right. Once the truth was spoken, there was no returning to silence. The response was immediate. But not the kind she hoped for. The family didn't react with shock. They didn't react with concern. They reacted with defense. Daniel denied everything, calmly, confidently. He spoke as someone who knew the room was already on his side. His parents stood beside him. They questioned Sarah's story. They questioned her motives. They questioned her stability. They said she was confused, emotional, misinterpreting innocent behavior. The narrative shifted quickly. It was no longer about what Daniel had done. It was about who Sarah was. Her past was examined, her behavior dissected, her emotions used against her. Every tear became evidence of instability. Every hesitation became doubt. Sarah was asked to repeat her story again and again, each time to people who already doubted her. The more she spoke, the smaller she felt. The more she explained, the less she was believed. Authorities were contacted. Questions were asked, but without physical evidence, without witnesses willing to support her, the investigation stalled. The family's influence mattered. Their cooperation mattered, and they gave neither. The case faded quietly. No arrest, no charges, just paperwork and unanswered questions. For the family, this felt like relief. The danger had passed, or so they thought. But for Sarah, everything had changed. She was treated differently. Whispers followed her. Looks lingered. Some people avoided her. Others watched her with suspicion. She became isolated, and isolation has a way of silencing people permanently. Daniel, meanwhile, returned to his life unchanged. He attended family gatherings. He was welcomed back into familiar spaces. No restrictions, no consequences, only reassurance. He had crossed a line, and nothing had happened. That realization changed him. He learned that denial worked, that protection was guaranteed, that the truth could be crushed, and that knowledge made him dangerous. Sarah was left with the weight of what she had done. She had spoken the truth, and the truth had been rejected. She carried the blame for disrupting the family, for causing tension, for making people uncomfortable. The message was clear. Silence would have been easier for everyone but her. And while the family moved on, while life returned to its carefully maintained normal, Daniel had learned the most important lesson of all. He was untouchable. What happens next is what happens when silence teaches a monster that no one will stop him. After Sarah spoke up, something changed. Not in the way anyone hoped. There were no arrests, no public reckoning, no consequences. Outwardly, life went on. But beneath the surface, the silence grew heavier, because Sarah was not the only one. There were others, children who had felt the same fear, who had experienced the same discomfort, who had noticed the same pattern. But after watching what happened to Sarah, they stayed quiet. They learned the lesson quickly. Speaking up did not bring protection. It brought isolation. So they said nothing. Some of them didn't have the words yet. Others didn't believe they would be believed, and some were simply too afraid. The silence spread. It settled into the house, into family gatherings, into everyday moments. Children avoided eye contact. Adults pretended not to notice. Everyone adjusted. This is how abuse survives, not through force alone, but through adaptation. Daniel Mercer noticed the change immediately. He noticed the way children avoided him, the tension in the room, the unspoken awareness. But he also noticed something else. No one was stopping him. No one confronted him. No one restricted him. No one removed him. So he adapted too. He became quieter, more careful, more calculated. He learned which moments were safest, which spaces were least observed. He learned how to blend in again. And as time passed, the fear in the children deepened. Some withdrew completely. They stopped laughing, stopped talking, stopped trusting. Others acted out, anger, sudden mood swings, behavior no one could explain. Parents noticed the changes, but not the cause. They blamed school, stress, social media, anything but the truth. Because the truth was too uncomfortable. There were moments when someone almost spoke up. A question half-formed, a concern raised and quickly dismissed. But every time someone reminded them what happened to Sarah. And the moment passed. The system failed quietly. Schools reported nothing. Doctors saw symptoms but no context. Authorities had no new complaints. And without new complaints, there was nothing to investigate. Daniel remained free, protected not just by his family, but by the absence of noise. This is the part no one likes to talk about. The part where abuse continues not because people don't know, but because they don't want to know. Children learn to survive in silence. Some dissociated, some normalized what was happening. Some convinced themselves it was their fault. Because when no one intervenes, you assume the problem is you. Years passed. The damage accumulated. Trauma doesn't disappear when it's ignored. It settles into the body, into memory, and the family carried on as if nothing was wrong. Photos were still taken, holidays were still celebrated, smiles were still rehearsed, but the atmosphere had changed. The house no longer felt safe. It felt watched, controlled, heavy with unspoken truth. Daniel knew it. He could feel the fear, and fear, when left unchecked, becomes power. By now, the monster no longer needed protection. He had something stronger: silence. But silence has a limit. And when it finally breaks, it breaks violently. Silence can last a long time, but it cannot last forever. After years of avoidance, something began to change. Not inside the family, but outside it. Daniel Mercer had grown comfortable, too comfortable. He had spent years learning where the limits were and how far he could push them. He believed he was invisible. Protected not just by his family, but by time, because time has a way of dulling suspicion. People stop watching, stop questioning, stop remembering. And Daniel relied on that. But monsters who feel safe eventually make mistakes. The first mistake was confidence. Daniel began to take risks he hadn't before. He stayed longer than necessary, lingered where he once moved carefully. Assumed silence meant permission. The second mistake was exposure. He started spending time around people who were not part of the family's protective circle, people who didn't know the history, people who hadn't been conditioned to look away. And then there was one moment that changed everything, a moment that couldn't be explained, couldn't be softened, couldn't be dismissed. This time, the reaction was immediate, the fear was visible, the distress undeniable, and for the first time, there were witnesses. More than one. Daniel tried to control the situation. He minimized, deflected, played confused. But something was different now. The story no longer belonged to him. Word began to spread. Quietly at first. A conversation here, a warning there. People started comparing notes, and when they did, a pattern emerged. The same name, the same discomfort, the same fear. What had once felt isolated now felt connected. The silence cracked. Authorities were contacted again. This time they listened, because this time there was more. More accounts, more consistency, more courage, and something else. Evidence. Not enough to explain everything, but enough to ask harder questions. Daniel felt the shift immediately. The casual confidence was gone. He became defensive, agitated, watchful. The family noticed too. They began to panic. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Voices were raised for the first time in years. Some wanted to continue denying everything. Others realized the situation was spiraling. For the first time, the family wasn't unified. Cracks appeared. Blame shifted. Old arguments resurfaced. And beneath it all, fear. Fear that the truth they had buried was about to be uncovered. Daniel attempted to regain control. He reached out to people privately, tried to explain, tried to reframe, but it was too late. Once multiple voices speak at once, silence loses its power. Investigators began connecting timelines. Stories lined up, details matched. What once seemed like coincidence now looked deliberate. Daniel was questioned, not casually, formally, and for the first time, he couldn't talk his way out. His calm exterior began to crack. Small contradictions appeared, inconsistencies that couldn't be ignored, and those inconsistencies mattered, because the perfect crime is only perfect as long as the story holds. Daniel's didn't. As pressure mounted, the family faced a decision: protect him or protect themselves. They had spent years choosing silence. Now silence was no longer an option. Something had to give, and when it did, everything came rushing out. But just when the truth seemed clear, the story took a turn no one expected. Just when everything seemed to be pointing in one direction, the story shifted. Investigators had a name, a pattern, a growing list of accounts. But then, another possibility emerged, one that complicated everything. A new detail surfaced during the investigation, a piece of information that didn't quite fit. Someone else had access. Someone else had opportunity. And suddenly, the focus widened. Attention shifted to a different figure, a person who had been present, who had been around the children, who had reasons of their own. For a brief moment, this new possibility made sense. The timeline aligned. The behavior raised questions. The evidence appeared convincing. Media speculation followed quickly. Whispers turned into headlines. Opinions hardened before facts were confirmed. The family seized on this immediately. They pointed away from Daniel, toward the alternative explanation. This is who you should be looking at. This is the real problem. For the first time, they felt hope. Hope that the truth could be redirected, that the story could be rewritten. Investigators followed the lead. They had to, because ignoring it would mean missing something important. Time was spent chasing the new angle. Interviews were conducted, records examined, timelines reconstructed, and for a while, the case stalled, the momentum slowed. Daniel watched closely. He said little. Let the confusion do the work for him. The red herring had done its job. Public attention drifted. Doubt returned. But something didn't sit right. The stories didn't fully line up. The emotional responses didn't match. Key details refused to connect. Investigators noticed it too. The new suspect's timeline collapsed under scrutiny. The behavior lacked consistency. The motive didn't hold. Piece by piece, the theory unraveled. What remained was the original pattern. The same name, the same fear, the same silence. The red herring was cleared, quietly, deliberately, and when it was removed, everything snapped back into focus. The truth had never changed. It had only been delayed. For the family, this was the final moment of denial. There were no more distractions, no more misdirection, only consequences. And Daniel knew it. The shield that had protected him for years was finally cracking. The story never made sense because it wasn't true. The story never made sense because it wasn't true. For years, everything Daniel Mercer said had been carefully constructed. Every explanation, every denial, every calm response. They were not meant to tell the truth. They were meant to confuse it. Investigators went back to the beginning, not to what Daniel said, but to what didn't change. The timelines, the repeated patterns, the consistent fear. When they listened closely, the same details kept appearing. Different voices, different years, same behavior, same name. Daniel's statements were compared side by side. The contradictions were small at first, a detail that shifted, a memory that changed, but small contradictions matter. Because truth doesn't move, lies do. When investigators confronted Daniel with these inconsistencies, his calm began to fracture. He corrected himself too quickly, clarified things no one had questioned, and then he made a mistake, a detail he volunteered that only someone involved would know. It was subtle, but it changed everything. The room went quiet, because in that moment, the story collapsed. Investigators revisited the family, this time with evidence. They asked different questions, harder ones. And for the first time, the family's answers didn't align. Robert Mercer insisted he had known nothing. Elaine Mercer claimed she had suspected, but hoped she was wrong. Their statements contradicted each other, and those contradictions mattered, because they revealed the truth the family had spent years hiding. They had known, not everything, but enough to intervene, enough to protect. Instead, they chose silence. The evidence continued to build: digital records, witness timelines, behavioral patterns. Each piece alone was fragile. Together, they were undeniable. Daniel was arrested, not dramatically, not violently, quietly, the way the truth often arrives. At trial, the mask finally fell. Witnesses spoke, some for the first time, some through tears, others with voices that shook but did not break. Each story filled in a piece of the picture, a picture that had been hidden in plain sight. Daniel listened, silent now. Gone was the confidence, the calm. When confronted with the evidence, there was no grand confession, no apology, just a breakdown, a recognition that the shield was gone. The family watched as the truth unfolded. Some cried, some looked away. Others sat in silence, unable to face what their protection had allowed. The verdict came down. Guilty. The room exhaled. But relief was complicated, because justice, arriving late, does not erase what came before. Daniel Mercer was sentenced. The monster was finally named. But the story did not end with him, because this was never just about one man. It was about the people who saw and chose not to act. Justice answered one question, but it left another behind. When the verdict was read, there was no celebration, no sense of victory, only a quiet, heavy relief. Daniel Mercer was gone, removed from the spaces he had occupied for so long, separated from the people he had harmed. But the damage he left behind did not disappear with him. For the victims, justice arrived late, too late to undo what had already been done. Some returned home, carrying years of trauma that could not be measured in court documents. Others struggled to explain why closure didn't feel like peace, because justice does not rewind time. It only acknowledges what happened. For some, the verdict brought validation, a confirmation that they had not imagined it, that their fear had been real, that their silence had not meant consent. For others, it reopened wounds, memories resurfaced, pain resurfaced. The truth, once spoken aloud, can be as painful as it is freeing. Sarah Collins watched the outcome from a distance. She had spoken first, and paid the price for it. Now, the world believed her, but belief came years too late to spare her the isolation she endured. She carried both relief and grief. Relief that the truth was finally known. Grief for the girl she had been before no one listened. The Mercer family retreated from public view. Neighbors stopped waving. Friends disappeared. The image they had protected for so long collapsed overnight. Some family members expressed regret. Others remained silent. A few continued to insist they had done the best they could, but the question lingered. What does the best mean when children are asking for help? The community reacted with shock. How did no one know? How could this happen here? But those questions avoided a harder truth. People had known. They had sensed. They had suspected. They had chosen comfort instead of confrontation. Institutions reviewed their failures. Policies were rewritten. Procedures were adjusted. But policies cannot heal trauma. They can only try to prevent the next one. Years after the trial, the victims continued to live with the aftermath. Some sought therapy. Some avoided reminders. Some rebuilt their lives quietly. None of them walked away unchanged. Because trauma does not end when a sentence is handed down. It echoes in relationships, in trust, in memory. Daniel Mercer became another name in a long list of convicted offenders. But for those who lived through it, he was never just a name. He was a presence, a shadow. And though he was gone, the impact remained. Justice had spoken, but it could not restore what had been taken. And that is the part of this story that no verdict can change. Sometimes the truth is screaming, even when no sound comes out. This story was never just about a monster. Monsters are easy to name, easy to condemn. What's harder to face are the people who looked away, the ones who sensed something was wrong but chose silence, the ones who valued comfort over courage, reputation over responsibility, because evil rarely survives alone. It survives in families, in communities, in systems that teach us it's easier not to see. For years, the signs were there. In fear, that didn't make sense. In children who grew quiet. In moments that made people uncomfortable, and discomfort was ignored. Not because people didn't know, but because knowing would have required action. Silence is not neutral. It is a decision that shapes outcomes, a decision that protects monsters. The victims in this story did not fail. They tried to speak. They tried to be heard. The failure belonged to the adults who chose not to listen. If there is anything this story leaves behind, it is this. When a child's behavior changes suddenly, when fear appears without explanation, when something feels wrong, listen. Ask the hard questions. Sit with the discomfort, because the cost of silence is always paid by someone else. Justice came late in this story, too late to undo the harm, too late to erase the damage. But the truth still matters, because truth is how silence ends, and silence is where monsters grow.